It looks like I've started recording, if that's all right with you.
Yep, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share. Great. All right. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. The purpose of this feedback session is to gather initial feedback from members regarding topics that they want to discuss further at the public council meetings. These feedback sessions are not deliberative, and the feedback gathered will be summarized and presented at subsequent public meetings. And we are also recording these sessions, and they'll be posted to the Climate Act website. The topics that we have teed up for today are electricity, climate justice, and economy-wide chapters. And since we've been having a kind of robust feedback so far from members, we figured we would just jump right in to member feedback, starting with electricity, and then we can move on to the other two topics from there once council members have had the opportunity to weigh in with their feedback on each of those. And so I'm seeing that we've got Bob Howarth, we've got Gavin Donahue, we've got Donna DeCarolis. I'm also seeing Keisha Santiago Martinez representing the Department of State. Any other council members on that I haven't recognized? Right, great. So let's get started.
Secretary Rodriguez is on.
Oh, you are, great. Thank you for joining us. Great, so let's jump in with any feedback that you might have on the electricity chapter. And I'm not seeing participants here, so let me see. Gavin, you've got your hand up.
Good morning, everybody. Got a handful of comments. The passing reference just to improving competitive tier 2 program. We've talked about how important renewables are to the state and RECs leaving the state currently. I think there needs to be more language there about how to protect the future of our existing renewable energy base. That's one comment. The next comment that I feel very strongly about is updated numbers that the ISO has put out relative to the need for zero emission resources, or now called DEFRs. The fact that I don't think the numbers in this draft are up to date. The ISO just recently called for 95 gigawatts to get to 100 by 40. And this point I want to make here is that the ISO is saying we need 27 gigawatts of new DEFRs. Something that I think should be footnoted at a minimum or mentioned up front is a number of us have been calling for the PSC to move on a pending petition that was jointly sponsored by myself, Donna, the labor unions, on how to deal with these DEFR issues and the issue of zero emissions in the future. And there's no mention to that petition at the PSC. I think there should be a mention to that because it's been pending there for over a year and a half. And I strongly think that that's probably a vehicle based on the CLCPA law and what the requirements are of the PSC, for the PSC to actually, in consultation with the DEC, which I think Peter raised, to determine what those DEFRs are. The next comment I had was there's a reference to a blueprint to replace New York City's oldest and highest emitting facilities by 2030. And that there's a process underway at the PSC and or DEC, I'm not certain, where a document will be finished by 2023 for that to happen, My lawyers and my staff, we've been trying to track this down. We can't seem to find the reference, but at a minimum, there should be some sort of footnote reference to that activity and the fact that that is scheduled to be finished in 2023. My last comment on this chapter sort of falls in line with tier 2 is a decision on the ZEC program and a timetable to commit to reauthorizing or modifying, or whatever the right word should be, to reauthorize the ZEC program. Because the nuclear units need time, year to a year and a half, to make decisions about how they're going to refuel these reactors. And the fact that we don't commit, all we really do say is that the existing nuclear is important, but some sort of timetable commitment to doing the reauthorizing the ZEC program, I think is very important to show that we're really serious about our commitment to existing nuclear. And again, as I mentioned at my first point, the existing renewables. So those are my points, and I appreciate the opportunity to raise them.
Thank you, Gavin. Bob?
Thank you, Sarah. I have a handful of comments as well. If we can go to page 7, about in the middle there's a addition that talks about peaker generators saying that they need to run infrequently and are needed to respond to demand in real time. I don't think needed is the right word. It's of course true that that's how the system is operating in New York right now, but what you really need is some sort of dispatchable power, and storage could certainly do it instead and does do it in some other places. So I suggest changing needed to something that describes what we're doing now, but does not suggest that that has to continue to be the case, because of course it can't be under the CLCPA. And at the bottom of that same page, I think we should, in addition to things stated there that we say need to be done, all of which I agree with, I think we should also improve management on the demand side of electricity use. And in that context, I would note that the recent McKinsey report that I shared with various members of all the members of the council yesterday shows a very high value to thermal storage, in part because it helps with the demand side electricity management. So I would suggest enlarging on that, perhaps including the McKinsey report. Scrolling way down, I've got a bunch towards the end. Give me a second while I scroll for them. Bear with me, please.
No problem.
Okay, on page 20. On that first, on the second bullet, where it says to expand CCA eligibility, it says the PSC should enable county governments. And I agree, but why not also include municipal governments, towns, cities, and villages? Maybe there's some reason that it has to just be counties, but I know I talked to leaders in various towns and villages who are interested in seeing this happen, so I would suggest broadening out that language. And then down on page 22, in the second bullet, again on planning, I'd like to say that the state should also be modeling and planning for better demand side management, again, including local thermal storage and also electric vehicles as storage means. So just broadening out how we think and how we plan. And it's a long chapter. It's going way down. On page 31, the first bullet there in the components of the strategy emphasizes that we should be doing this consultation and planning specifically or especially downstate. And I don't, I mean, we should be doing downstate for sure, but I think we also need to be doing it upstate. Particularly, we need to be addressing the peak winter loads, which are going to be more of an issue upstate than downstate because it's colder, and the demand response planning and all again should be part of that. So I would urge that we not just do this for the downstate region. On page 33 under E10 Explore Technology Solutions, I believe we should drop RNG from this. I think we have enough evidence that the greenhouse gas footprint of RNG is quite large and the resource is small. And so I would drop that. I also suggest that we drop green hydrogen from here, not because I don't think we should be looking at green hydrogen, but simply because green hydrogen is one of many long-term, long-duration storage technologies, and why we're singling out as if it's something different, I think, is a little strange. On page 34, there's an additional word here that says the CJWG contends, and I disagree with the use of the word contends. I mean, they do contend. They're also right. Objective data support their contention. So as written, it makes it sound like this is just some weird thought coming from them and maybe not backed up with much. Whereas, in fact, as we've discussed in the alternative fuels group all summer long, there's a lot of evidence that supports exactly what they say. And on page 35, under alternative fuels on prioritization bullet, it says possibly RNG could fill this gap in order to maintain reliability if scalability, feasibility, and environmental impact and air quality issues can be addressed. That's a huge if for me. Again, the greenhouse gas footprint is simply too large to make this acceptable under the CLCPA, and it's a really, really small resource. So I would urge that we drop that. I think it's misleading to the public to leave it in. And on the next page, under the analysis of footprint, we have a bunch of bullets. One towards the end there says research on emissions controls that reduce, eliminate emissions, e.g. NOx from hydrogen combustion. I'm fine with that, but we also want to look at research on emissions and leaks of hydrogen itself directly, because we now know that hydrogen emissions have direct climate consequences, and we should start to be paying more attention to what those emissions are. As far as I know, New York has absolutely no idea how much hydrogen could leak. That hasn't really been considered at all, so that should be a priority. And later down that same page on nuclear generation, it says advanced nuclear may provide a way to develop and deploy new nuclear resources faster at lower cost and improve safety, et cetera, et cetera. And my question is, what are we comparing advanced nuclear to here? We're certainly not comparing them to wind and solar, which are demonstrably cheaper, safer, faster to deploy, have less waste. And so presumably the comparison is with the current nuclear technology. And if so, that's okay, but let's say so. And I also think it's important to note that no one, including those strongest advocates for this new advanced modular nukes, think that they'll play any significant role in the United States much before 2040 or 2045. And I think we should explicitly say so. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal, I believe last week, that made that point. There are plenty of others making it. So we don't want to, again, mislead people into thinking that this technology is going to be something that's going to help us with the 2030 goals or even the 2040 goals. It might help after 2050, but it's way off in the future, as I think Tom Falcone raised at our last meeting as well. So those are my comments on this chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Donna.
Morning, Sarah, and thank you. And I will send a matrix as well, okay? But I just also have a handful for this chapter. And my first one starts on 26, and it focuses on, I think this comment was made earlier by Gavin, but so it kind of is similar in nature. I think we need more focus on the DFRs, is what I'll call them, the dispatchable and emissions-free resources that'll be needed. And at the top of 26, where we talk about the need for DFRs, I think, and then we list a number of studies, the New York ISO Grid and Transition and Climate Change Study. I think we should add the recently issued September 22nd study, which is their 20-year outlook. They call it the System and Resource Outlook, or the Outlook. And that has an updated perspective and has a range of, I think, for two scenarios, from 27 to 45 gigawatts of DFRs required. So I would include that. My next one was on page 31. And here, where we have components of the strategy under planning and analysis and cost study, where we talk about completing the study to find ways to avoid or reduce grid upgrade costs through various means, I would include analysis of this hybrid heating approach, which we've talked about, and I think I've provided the study in the past that was done, the National Grid and New York City study, and their study is showing the amount of avoided grid build out with use of the hybrid approach for emissions reduction. So I would, especially for upstate, I would include that as a pathway to be explored. And then my next one is on page 33, and this is under investing in new technology, where we talk about the 15 to 25 gigawatts. Here again, I would include the updated New York ISO study, the September 22nd study. However, we include it either there or in the footnote, and their range of needed generation was higher. So I don't think that's being properly, or it's not being fully included here. I would add on this page, and where we talk about explore technology solutions, I guess I'm affirming the inclusion of RNG and green hydrogen. To me, when I read this, it seems to be mentioned, but in an unnecessarily negative way. And I think, again, I've said it before, I'm in the group of keeping options on the table versus eliminating options when we're this early in a really critical transition. So I just feel like that's just generally done it's just written in a way that's a little bit negative in my approach. So in my view, so I can send you some thoughts on that. And same at the bottom of that page, at the last paragraph, when it comes to alternative fuels, while they are often touted as flexible and dispatchable, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think there's been a lot of work done in this draft plan to try to include the way to evaluate alternative fuels and find ways to use them properly and appropriately to help reduce emissions. So that's kind of the general nature of the comment. And then I had one last one on page 35 at the bottom with the prioritization. Again, I had just a different perception when I read this. The second sentence, however, should a substitute for natural gas still be needed, green hydrogen and possibly RNG could fill this gap, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it feels to me unnecessarily negative. And I do think we need to evaluate it. We need to include it. I disagree with this view that that RNG is too small. I think we've talked about this before. We have the NYSERDA ICF study, which noted that RNG has significant potential. RNG feedstock resources from food waste, manure, agricultural residues, et cetera. Happy to send this along. And also the SUNY ESF study, which says that RNG has the potential to make meaningful contributions to New York climate and health targets under the CLCPA. So again, it's more of a tone, and I think it's important to keep it on the table and include it. So thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Any other feedback on the electricity chapter? All right, not seeing any. We can move to climate justice. Does anyone have comments on climate justice?
I do not.
Okay. Then moving to economy-wide. Any questions or feedback on economy-wide? Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I have just a couple. Let me see if I can find them in the draft. Okay, the first one is on the first page here, and it's at the end of the second paragraph. And it says that we've determined, well, basically we're throwing out the third option, and I understand why, I guess, and that probably is based on a lot of back and forth discussion in the working group behind this chapter, but I wasn't part of that, and we haven't had much discussion in the council as a whole, and so I would think that we ought to have a little bit more explanation in this chapter as to what's driving this decision. So just asking for, I don't disagree with it, but some more elaboration, if nothing else, so it will convince the average person on the street or politicians that this is something we considered and moved on from.
Bob, you're referring to the clean energy supply standard being referred to sector-specific discussion?
Yeah, I think so. And that makes sense, I guess, but we haven't really picked it up in those individual chapters either. So we're basically just putting it aside with this decision, right?
Well, I guess the only thing to flag is that in front of the council, we've had discussions about the clean transportation standard, which would
a little bit with the suggestion from the NISO that we have one for the electric sector, but the discussion there, at least as I remember it, and I agree with it, is that we didn't want to do it sector by sector because it'd get us into weird torsions if we increase the cost of electricity by doing it, but we're not taxing gasoline or natural gas, then it's a disincentive for beneficial electrification of transportation or heating, for instance. So I just think we should say those sorts of things here.
Well, I guess I just want to be, I don't think the intent with that sentence is to say that we shouldn't do these policies. So,
well, but the recommendation is that we have a economy-wide approach, and I don't think it's going to make sense personally to have an additional sector by sector on top of that either. It's sort of left hanging out there. And looking, I mean, I haven't gone back through the sector-specific chapters, although I just read the electric one. Of course, we're just discussing it, and the electric sector doesn't say anything at all about this, and I don't think the transportation one does, and I don't think the housing one does. So we're not really picking it up elsewhere. As a council, we really are dropping the idea, which I'm fine with. I'm not arguing that we do otherwise. I'm just suggesting it's somewhere in our report, and I think it's probably here. We explain the logic behind that.
So Bob, if I could, just a couple things. I think we have a clean energy supply standard already for electricity. That's the clean energy standard.
Okay.
Right? So that exists already, and there is the proposal for one for transportation. So
that's in the transportation chapter still?
That's the clean transportation standard.
Okay.
And so the only big sector where it's not being pursued is in buildings, the use of fuels in buildings.
So the proposal here that we're going with in this chapter, we do have, thank you for correcting me, we have sector specific plans for electricity and for transportation, but not for industry and not for buildings, et cetera. And so we are proposing an economy-wide cap and invest that would incorporate those economic specific ones that we are moving ahead with in transportation and electricity as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by incorporate, but
Well, that's not additive, I guess.
well, it is additive.
Okay. Well, and I'm just plain confused. So
Yeah.
maybe we need a little bit more clarity.
It is additive, just like, the clean energy standard is what gets renewable energy cited in New York. The cap and invest program ensures that we reduce emissions. So think of the cap and invest as sort of an overlay, an umbrella over the whole economy. Underneath that, there's many, many, many policies, right?
Sure.
And the heat pumps, in buildings, clean energy standard in electricity, clean transportation standards have mandates in transportation. Those all underlie. So maybe, I think your point of articulating this a little more, makes sense.
Well, just to help me out, if nothing else, but I'm not expert in this area clearly, and I'm confused, but I'm probably not the only one, either on the council or certainly in the public. So just clarifying how it would fit in, I think would be useful, if for no other
Yep.
reason than to help me out. So I go to explain it to friends and critics. I can
Sure.
do so. It's just a moment I'm struggling to do. Thanks. I think I have two other comments. Let me scroll down through and see if I can find them. Yeah, the next one is on page 3, and it's in that first paragraph. And it says we're going to leave out non-fossil fuel agricultural emissions because they're difficult to monitor. And there are two things here. We haven't done a good job of monitoring them, but I don't think it's difficult to monitor them. I think within the next year or 2, 3 perhaps, the state should be in a pretty good position to monitor those if they want to. Certainly, a lot of us are working on developing the ways to do that. But on the other hand, I thought that the CLCPA specifically exempted dairy farms from any sort of control. So I don't disagree that we should leave dairy farms out of here, but I'm thinking we're explaining that away for the wrong reasons. And maybe I'm wrong on the exemption under the CLCPA, but that's how. And I did not go back to read the language, but certainly when that was being discussed in the predecessor bill back in 2016, dairy farms were exempted from that. And the other issue I have is that we have this language, other considerations, and I guess I have no idea what other considerations might be. So I would suggest giving an example of that, or deleting it, or explaining a little bit more. I was trying to even think of what it is, and I really don't know. So it just seems kind of hanging there. Detail, but
I'm sorry, Bob, where was that?
In that first paragraph about what sectors we're covering or not. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, exactly. It's at the end of that first sentence, actually, very, very long sentence, and it ends, or other considerations.
Okay.
It's just too vague for my taste. I'm sure there's logic behind it, but let's say what it is. And I think I just have one more comment. Let me scroll down and find it. Thought I had one more. I'm not finding it at the moment. Must be at the end, huh? Oh. Maybe that's it.
All right. Thanks, Bob.
Yep,
If you
that's it.
find, okay, great.
Thank you.
No problem. Gavin.
My only comment on this is we don't seem to deal with how RGGI and the existing RGGI program is incorporated in this cap and invest program. That is a concern from the generator sector, that we don't have two competing programs. And if I've read it wrong or misunderstand it, I'm sure Jared will correct me, but there's RGGI seems to, there's no real plan about if you have this cap and invest program, what happens to RGGI. The other thing that is got me concerned, because, and I know Jared's heard this from me, the RGGI program, the allowance prices never got high enough, really, in my mind, to make a huge difference in New York and other places. And there's no real commitment in this cap and invest program to some price level. And maybe that's just the way it is. But those are just observations. And this was a real tough chapter to get my arms around, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of clarity to what we're trying to do here. And maybe that's what will happen in the regulatory process, but I'm just concerned that we're not given any level of comfort, to me, as somebody who does represent industry, as to what the program is going to be and how it's going to work. And maybe that's to come, and it's not a language change. It's just how we view the chapter, so to speak. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. I mean, there is a point there that the program should be structured to reflect that many electricity sources are subject to RGGI. And I think the real question is exactly how do we do that? Do we exempt sources that are already covered by RGGI? Do we give them credit for what they pay into RGGI? Do we leave RGGI? I sort of see there's, three options to consider there, and that's not, we don't answer that here, but that would be one of those things that would be answered in the rulemaking process.
I don't see what the harm would be to say what you just said as part of this chapter. I appreciate what you just said, and I'm hopeful that that's what ultimately happens in the regulatory process. But I think it would be nice to put that in the chapter, maybe as a footnote, or that wording as that the state would consider in the formation of the program, what you just said, because that's sort of what I'm getting at, Jared.
Yeah.
I think on your other point, maybe Gavin, on the price adequacy, there's a discussion on page 7 around price floors. The floor isn't determined, but there, it sort of talks about that being an option along with reserves and things like that to provide price certainty. I think we don't know right this second, like what that price floor, like how to effectuate a price floor, at what level it should be, because I think we'll want to think that through more as part of the rulemaking process. But I didn't know if that discussion on page 7 was inadequate, or if you had feedback on the way it was described, or anything that might be useful for us as we steps.
On a wording front, I'm just looking at this again on page 7. I think a price signal that would be adequate enough to secure the future investment in emission reducing technologies, I think is a statement that would be a little better.
Okay.
Because we want the signal to get high enough so that we actually invest in new technologies. And that's sort of what I'm trying to get at.
Understood. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. Donna?
Thanks, Sarah. Just a couple, and I was not on this subgroup, so I also I don't know if I have my arms around this either. So my comments are general and might also just be more questions than comments. But one is, to me, again, I come at it from the consumer perspective. I feel like the consumer cost impact isn't really known for this, and maybe that's just how it is. But to me, that's just a concern. And if it's not implemented correctly, I think the devil's in the details, which you all know, it could have economic impacts that we may not want it to have. So I guess how do we tackle that? And in particular, and I'll get into it, I think there's a section on regional, there's a regional,
yeah, regional
so I'll hold that one till we get to that page. And then this is similar to the earlier discussion we had about the third option identified in the plan, a clean energy supply standard. It struck me too that maybe there were other options not being considered, and are they set aside or could they be evaluated for the future? Something like, and I'll go to page 2 now, where we talk about cap and invest have been implemented economy-wide in California and Quebec and Washington recently. In California, they had companion standards. So they have a low cost fuel or a low carbon fuel standard and a renewable gas standard. So to me, when you look at the options, I do agree cap and invest is better than just some sort of a economy-wide carbon tax. I think this is a better approach. The devil's in the details, and I think it could work better if it was paired with something else. So I wonder if there's a way to keep that discussion open. So to me, back to the concept of investing in emissions reducing technologies, those kinds of standards could be beneficial if they were paired with this, I think. And then I had one on page 5, and this is under energy intensive and trade exposed industries and leakage. Just curious, and I know we talk about the Appendix C, which we talked about the other day. Who will be included? Who will be excluded from, or who would be able to get the credits for, the allocated allowances? And we talk about exposure to international trade, but I wonder how we're considering domestic trade exposure or nearby states, in industries that in our region, we have many that have multiple state locations and they could be disadvantaged relative to a plant in Pennsylvania, for example. So is there a way to reflect consideration for that as well? And then my last one was on page 10 under regional equity. Again, depending on how this works, I feel like it could have a disproportionate burden on some regions. Of course, I'm thinking about Western New York, where we are colder, we use more energy. So could it be disproportionately burdening areas that are using more energy and certainly using more natural gas, versus other parts of the state where we're more dependent on it now. So I think that's all that I had.
Thank you, Donna.
Hey,
Go for it.
Donna, just on that last point on the regional equity, as we point out in the last sentence there, that we think probably the investment of proceeds is the best way of addressing those regional disparities. If you have regional concerns, if you have other ideas, happy to consider those. But I suppose you could think about having like different tiers, of allowances. But that really then interferes with the economic efficiency of the program. So any thoughts you have would be welcome.
Thank you. And I meant to say this early on, Jared and all, I think you do attempt to address all these concerns. I see that when I read it. So I think these are things that are going to be challenging.
Okay, got it.
Any other feedback on economy-wide? Any additional feedback on any of the topics discussed here today, electricity, climate justice, or economy-wide?
We're very efficient today.
Excellent. All right. Well, with that, we can close out the meeting a bit early, give you back some of your time. We will have another one of these sessions this afternoon at 2 o'clock.
Sarah,
welcome to join us there.
Sarah, before you drop, can you just list to me, just so I'm completely prepared for Monday, which chapters we are going to talk about on Monday? I just want to make sure
Yep.
Because I'm going to be traveling and not have all my notes with me, and I want to make sure I know which chapters.
Sure. It's the batch of chapters that you received after the past council meeting. So it's gas system transition,
Okay.
buildings, industry, health, electricity, climate justice, and economy-wide.
Okay. I apologize for wasting time here. I just want to make sure I have
Yep.
it straight.
Understood.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.